How's it going? Today I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about the power of interviewing and kind of interview research when you're not doing nonfiction, when you're doing fiction or poetry. One of the questions that people oftentimes ask when they start this journey and they're working on a work that's more fictional is, Eric, I don't quite understand how to do interviews. Why am I doing this and what's the power of it? So I thought that I'd prepare a short little discussion about some of the ways that I've seen this work very well, to give some examples and make sure sort of to give context of why we do it. Now, one of the things to think back on is for me to sort of learn how to teach this, I did have to go out and interview lots and lots of people. And I'll tell a couple quick stories of two of my favorite conversations. I had a conversation with a gentleman named Maurice, and his book is a work of fiction. It talks about some issues in race today and race and culture today. And it is a fictional work, but one of the interesting things talking to Maurice, who his book this year was named one of Publisher Weekly's 10 Best of 2019, which is an amazing kind of like recognition, is that we talked a lot about how he was able to write. And he's from New Orleans, and a lot of the writing he does has this really rich sort of feel and vibrancy of New Orleans. And what we talked a lot about is kind of one of the ways that he found the most powerful ways for him to be inspired was actually to have conversations with people. He said he spent a lot of time in coffee shops talking to people, having these conversations. And what that did is give him richness. He told me a very specific story about being in a coffee shop, having this conversation. And the conversation itself was interesting. But what was interesting mostly was how he was able to get kind of the vibe of the feel of that coffee shop, the other conversations going on, and that inspired him to do it. Now, it was a conversation he was having to get some richness for his book, but that was incredibly powerful. Another example is a friend of mine named Matthew Norman, and Matthew is a friend I grew up with. He has been now sort of a full-time author, having gone to MFA and now had several books, and he writes more in sort of the satire field of things. But what he has talked a lot about is one of the most important things is again, sort of being in the moment, being able to sort of like be there and understand how to become a better dialoguist, I guess, or a better person who can understand dialogue. So those are some really powerful examples of why these authors and many of the other ones said that one of the most important things that they did as they started writing was the process of research. And so what we're doing here in this case is being pretty structured about it. Again, each of you, even whether you're writing fiction, should be thinking about ways that you can, again, gather kind of information, insights, richness in order to help your book. So there's really two ways that I would say you'll likely find the power of some of these sorts of pieces. One way is to talk to people who are authors in your space, people who are writing fiction, who are writing characters and those sorts of things. So that is one of those ways of dialogues and discussions that you may have. So if, for example, you're writing in the horror genre, one of the things is to speak to people who are in the horror genre, to learn how to do it, learn the craft of it, get insights from them, or do secondary interviews with people. Go out and listen to things, who podcasts that some of the famous horror people have written about or talked about. Go out and see what they've said about developing their characters. Those concepts will help you with, again, richness, depth, and understanding those pieces. So that is a way to, again, learn the craft from some of these interviews, which is really great. And I think it's one of the powerful things you'll see on that front. Now, the other concept is actually how to use interviewing and secondary interviews, primary and secondary interviews, as a tool for you to, again, gather the richness you want. So what I mean by this is whenever you're going to write a story, you should understand that some of the best sort of fictional stories, really what they're doing is what's called fictionalizing facts. Now, what that means is that typically when you write fiction, you are inspired by some type of factual piece. And so a quick example in that case, if you're doing something that is a fictional work that has an element of crime in it, and you essentially decide that you need to have a police officer. Well, what many authors will do is they'll have conversations with police officers, or they'll listen to interviews with police officers, or they'll go out with the context of trying to find language and discussions in ways that they talk about it. Again, it's different than sort of traditional research. Instead, what you're doing is you're going out and trying to gather the words and the stories of these individuals and then fictionalize them for your case. Now, one of the other questions that people have is, well, how does this fit? I don't know, what should I I'd be doing when I think about these conversations. One of the other things that we'll talk about, so again, typically think about any story that fits within your overarching theme, your overarching plot line, as some way for you to find something, some conversations that you can fictionalize into facts. Now, the other concept that many people will use is what we call story eddies. Now, story eddies are those sorts of conversations, so those sorts of stories that don't necessarily feel like they may line up for the major story arc, but they're hyper powerful. I'll give you a very quick example. If you're working on, again, a book about crime, maybe one of those things that you want to do is describe some of the ways a coroner does some of their work. Now, what a story eddy is let's just say that you're able to do an interview with someone who's a coroner, or you're able to do a secondary interview kind of through research of a coroner. Now, one of the ways that you'll find that adds richness to your book, your writing, is to actually create what's called a story eddy. Now, story eddies are not along the main track of what you think there's going to be, but they're story eddies where you kind of come off the side of it and add more richness to it. For example, you may decide to write a story about a coroner and how they wound up like learning the craft. So if there's a character in there that's this, or you want to do that one, come off and tell a story that's not related to your book, but just as interesting in that way. And a quick example of how that plays out is, if for those of you that are familiar with Hamilton the musical, if you ever listened to some of the interviews that Lin-Manuel Miranda has done, he talks a lot about his approach to taking all of this massive stuff and creating something interesting. And that was that he would write the pieces, the vignettes that were inspiring to him. So for example, he spent some time writing about this funny scene that is true, based on kind of letters between Alexander Hamilton, and his wife's sister. They had this sort of funny, weird relationship, but what they would do is they would sort of, in some ways, create these sort of sexual innuendos in their writing, which was very bizarre in some ways. But for Lin, as he wrote this, Lin-Manuel, as he wrote this, he thought that's so interesting and rich. And so what it became is almost what's called a story eddy. It's something that doesn't fit within the story arc, but it adds richness. So he could talk about those pieces in that way. So as you're writing, as you're finding these things, don't feel like you simply have to write all of the things that line up with kind of what is the plot or the arc that you have. Write things that are interesting, that are broadly in context, but they'll serve as story eddies. So again, what you're going to be doing as you're thinking about reaching out is, every time you may have a scene or you may have a character, is there some type of person or some type of sort of people that you can go out and interview, either at a primary interview or a secondary interview, to give you richness and depth? You want to be looking for stories, conversations, background pieces that add richness to that one. That is sort of an important piece there. And then don't be afraid to let sort of these things kind of branch out a little bit into what we call story eddies. Story eddies are places that may not necessarily fit within the major arc that you have, but they are hyper powerful because they allow your reader to have this sort of richness that comes from kind of going off and coming back onto the storyline. So think of those story eddies. If you think of your main story as the river, story eddies, those pieces that kind of spin off and then spin you back in. So you think of the water coming along, some of it spins off and then spins back into that. That's what a story eddy would be. Now, the last way that you will potentially use the interviewing that you may do is something to actually add technical details. So for example, if you're working on a book that has something set in the future about artificial intelligence, it may be very helpful for you to interview someone that is working and operating in this space. So those can be really powerful ways to do this one. So as you think about spending time and going out and, again, starting to capture information from interviews you're doing and these secondary interviews that are sort of those ones, think about those sort of three themes. One type of the theme that you'll be seeing for a lot of the interviews may be that you want to talk to people who are in the space, who are writers, who are in the genre you want to do, who can teach you, again, meta insights about it, just to build your network and connect. So that's one type of person that's good to connect with. The second type of person is, again, someone that can add scene richness. So this is sort of things to add, again, be able to fictionalize facts or to be able to create story eddies. Those are the ones that you're going to look at sort of one sort of thing that's inspiring to you. I want to write this particular scene or this particular story. Who can I speak to or who can I research in order to help me have the richness to it? Again, that's one of the core things that I learned, is that in some ways, every scene oftentimes has some inspiration from it that'll come from a discussion that someone's had, or some type of more of a secondary research where you're going out and doing research and listening to interviews, reading content in that way. And then in the third way, and again I think is an important one, is, are there technical pieces that matter? So for example, if you're working on something in the world of fantasy even, is there a sense that you can do either conversations or richness to do things like sword fighting if you have that, or something about animals that can help help you understand even the biology of certain types of creatures you may want to have. So as we're going through this process, remember that the biggest thing to understand is that even though you may think, how can this possibly fit in? Why am I doing this stuff? The core thing is what we're trying to do is make sure that writing really is a contact sport. You go out, you learn, and bring that in, and I'll make it so much richer. So as you're writing, don't judge yourself to say, I don't know how this fits in the plot, whatever it is, I'm not sure. Everything that you do and everything that you learn is going to be helpful to give you, again, just better meta understanding, richness in the scenes you're doing, create these story eddies that are really powerful elements in your writing, and lastly, give you the technical competence you want to write in that way. So this is a specific one for you, whether you're doing fiction or even if you're doing poetry. In the same sort of way, when you're doing poetry, these will be similar. They'll help you add inspiration, they'll help you add depth. And remember, at the core of all of this as well, is it's not just necessarily about doing these things to improve the writing quality, which certainly is a big part of it. These are also important things to make sure that at the end, when we have the book, everyone can understand that this book is well done, well researched, and well put together, positioning you as an expert. So again, thinking of an author, Sierra, she's able to say, talking about her book of poems, you know, these poems were inspired by more than 36 conversations with women in the context of the Me Too movement and the Women's March and those sorts of things. So that's a powerful way to do it. If you're doing something in, a crime drama some way, be able to say, and author blank was able to, speak to dozens of people in law enforcement and in the crime world to understand the ins and outs of this world that she creates. Again, those sorts of pieces are really powerful. So we're doing it for two reasons. One is to create really rich, better content. It's going to help you make sure that you can write a full book, and that will come from these richer context pieces right there. You're going to be writing individual stories and scenes throughout. Some of them will be in the main track, the main river of your flow. Some of them will be eddies, but you're going to be doing these individual pieces, and you're going to have, again, a way to, at the end of this process, be able to point to people to say, this book is rich and depth because it's not just about my story. So hopefully that's helpful for any of the authors that are kind of in that process of questioning about some of the how this will fit out for them as using the interviews as a tool. And remember, you're going to be doing this process throughout. You'll be doing it from, again, the very beginning. We emphasize it a little bit to open doors, but tends to be that it'll be something you'll do throughout the entire process over the next 6 months as you decide, hey, I have this scene, I need to get more richness. Great. Maybe you go out and find a podcast interview to listen to add that depth to it. Or, for example, if you come up to a point where you're like, I really don't quite understand this piece of it, one of the best ways is to go out and find someone to talk to and be able to have that conversation. This process will help you build your network, it's going to help you build your credibility, and most importantly, create really great content. So hopefully that's helpful as we're diving into this one, and excited for the journey. Remember, we are going after this to just create content. Don't necessarily worry about exactly what the book is about yet, right? That's something that we're going to be solving as we get into the writing process further. Once you've got a bunch of words, then we'll figure out how it all comes together. Again, the best writers in the world typically don't write a story from beginning to end. They write pieces of it, and they assemble their manuscripts and their story at the end. So I hope that's helpful, and more adventures soon. Thanks, guys.